everyone, welcome. In this video I'm going to be talking about something that has kind of been boiling over on Board Game Geek's forums for Dune Imperium. That is the question of whether there is such a thing as first player advantage in Dune Imperium, whether there is an imbalance between player order. Let's talk about this. The first thing I actually wanted to say is that if we're actually going to be talking about imbalance, then we probably need to kind of define what that is, right? If there isn't a balance in Dune Imperium, there are a couple things that I think that would have to be true. At least some of these things would have to be true. First, we'd have to have some sort of unfair advantage for that first player in the resources category, because this is a resource gathering game. You're using your resources to get advantage and do other things, get points. And so if that were the case, we'd have to have some sort of issue with an unfair resource balance, right? We'd also probably have to have some sort of imbalance in combat, let's just say, because combat is one of the central focuses of this game. Every round, at the end of every round, you're going to resolve combat, and the person who wins combat gets some resources or points or some sort of other benefit. You might also see people claiming that there are imbalances because the first player is winning a lot of their games. So the first player must have to be winning a lot of games, and in fact, the majority of those games for there to be an imbalance. And then maybe there's some other advantage that the first player has that isn't seen here or isn't talked about here, and maybe we can talk about that at the end of this. So I just wanted to cover what we know about the first player, first of all. The first player is going to get to play first, of course, but that person is also going to draft last in the leader draft. So the fourth player, if you're fourth or third player, so it's a three-player game, you're going to draft first, and then it's going to go counterclockwise around the table back to the first player. So the first player gets to choose last. It means that the player who is playing first does not always get the pick they want. So if they really want a specific leader because the Imperium row is showing some really sweet cards for a particular leader, they might not get that leader. Well, we also know that the player 1 is going to always go first in a 4-player game, rounds 1, 5, and 9. And here I'm highlighting 9 because 9 is one of the level 3 conflicts, and so you're more likely to want to go first in those rounds so that you can, get the 6 spice and then drop the highliner on that round, action 1. You're also going to go first in rounds 1, 4, 7, and 10 in 3-player. So the first player is the only player that is actually going to, in a 3-player game, get to go first in twice in those level 3 conflicts. The player 1 can also get water first. They can go to still suits first. They have first choice, right? So they can go to still suits. They can also get the Mentat first. That's one of the interesting things about player 1. They can always get the Mentat first. And they can always get Hardy Warriors first, so they can drop 4 troops into the conflict, round 1, action 1. They can also get to selective breeding first by getting some spice and then jumping over to the selective breeding space in the Bene Gesserit Alliance track and trying to draw some more cards and cull cards out of their deck. And there's a couple other things, and we're going to talk about those things here in a second. But also I want to mention that the player 1 is always going to be able to reveal first if they play out if they take all of their actions, all of their agent turns, and they're going to show combat first. Very likely that they'll show combat first. Now, of course, this is without having other players reveal early, which can always throw a wrench into the equation. But let's just say that that's likely to happen. So let's take a look at this first one. If the first player has an unfair resource advantage, we need to know about this, right? So we need to be able to determine whether there is a way that we can see that there's an unfair resource advantage. And so we can probably kind of run through a couple of actions in round 1 and see if this actually leads to some sort of advantage. So the first player can do a couple things, right? We talked about them being able to get water first, the Mentat first, Hardy Warriors, all of the things they can go to first, pretty much, because they are first to select, right? So they have 2 actions on in their first round, and they'll probably be able to do any of these things that they want to. Well, let's see if any of these specific resource gathering techniques or patterns actually lead to a benefit. So let's talk about still suits. Action 1, go to still suits. Always a good option for any player. If you don't end up seeing the first player going to still suits, the second player is likely to go there because having 2 water gives you a lot of leverage. It lets you control the Great Flat, which is one of the most important spice generating areas in the game, and you need 2 water in order to go there. And so if you're the only person with 2 water, you can essentially hostage the Great Flat. You can also go to Haga Basin, right? And Haga Basin's a great one. If you go to still suits, and if nobody took Haga Basin on their first action, then you can go there and have a remaining water for the next round. That's great. Then you have 1 water and 2 spice. No problem. Seems like a good play. So what does this actually mean, though? You have 2 water, and no one else does. You can hostage that Great Flat, potentially getting 4 spice in round 2, which is what you want, because at the Maker's phase, a new spice is going to show up if nobody went to the Great Flat. But there are a couple of downsides. If you choose this kind of path, you're going to miss out on Solari, and Solari is going to help you generate your economy, right? Getting another Swordmaster, or getting to the High Council, or getting more troops. Those things are very important to win battles, to take more actions, to do things like that. Buying better cards. Your plan is not always to just get water and spice. You have to turn that into an advantage, and generally that's where the cell melange space comes in. One thing to note is that winning round 1 combats are usually just okay. They're not great. Sometimes they're a point, but the second place conflict bonuses are sometimes a little bit better. If player 2, 3, or 4 is Ariana Thorvald and has their ring in round 1, you actually won't even be able to hostage the Great Flat. So that might even fall apart. So this kind of plan where you think, I have 2 water and no one else does, might not even work, because they'll be able to go to the Great Flat before you in round 2. Additionally, if the conflict that comes up round 1 actually rewards water, then that whole plan falls apart. So it's kind of a house of cards, this first hostaging of the Great Flat. It works better with the second player. The second player has a better option of hostaging the Great Flat than the first player. Okay, well, let's say you want to go to Mentat first. What does that do? We can go up to Wealth or Secure Contract Action 1, and then we can hit up the Mentat Action 2. That seems pretty solid. What does that do for us? It's actually going to end up leaving you with 1 or no Solari, or maybe 2 if you go to Secure Contract and you're Leto or something like that. You will go last in the combat, which could be good. It helps you, potentially win that combat if you want to, but as I mentioned in the last portion of this presentation, winning combat round 1, not always great. It's not always great. It's not always worth it. You might end up buying higher. That means you might end up being able to afford something you had not been able to afford with the Mentat, because maybe you were holding a bunch of daggers in your hand and you ended up drawing into a convincing argument for 2 buy. That could be good. Though what you're doing is you're trading in 2 buy for 2 buy. So you end up kind of pat if you just revealed at the beginning of your turn. You will reshuffle round 2, and that's not a bad thing either. Being able to reshuffle round 2 means that if you have a card you really want to buy and then find immediately, you'll have a chance, though a low chance, to find it. So what does this mean as far as negatives? So you're not likely to win the combat because you're going to only have 1 shot at actually sending troops into the combat. You're going to only be able to send in the amount that you get plus the 2 from your garrison. All of the other desirable spaces are going to be likely taken in round 1, and the problem with trying to go to Mentat Action 2 is you don't have a lot of other resources, so you can't hit up things like Research Station. You already can't get to Siege Tabor. You probably won't get to the Great Flat, right? You can't get there. You'll probably be able to get to the Haga Basin, but it might be taken, and you might not have the cards that let you go to where you want to. So this is not turning your resources into an advantage right away. What about Hardy Warriors? Maybe you can go to Hardy Warriors and turn this into advantage. Well, certainly the Baron Harkonnen can do this, right? His Master Stroke ability lets you dump 4 troops into the combat with it, 2 that you get and 2 from your garrison, and then you can get some influence with the factions you chose at the beginning of the game. That's great. There are a couple of problems with this, and the problem is mainly that Still Suits is going to almost 100% of the time get taken. I don't think I've ever seen someone go Hardy Warriors and then get gifted Still Suits Action 1, Action 2. you are going to be out of water for several rounds, because that still suits early on is a highly contested spot. And it's then going to make it hard for you to get spice. You're going to have to try to get to the Imperial Basin, and you might not get there in time because you're going to go last in the second round. This could lead you to stall out early in the game. What about selective breeding? This is a good space. I actually quite like this one. And Haga Basin is a great Action 1 play that enables selective breeding. You don't have to go to still suits, then the gray flat, and then selective breeding round 2. You can just do it right away. What this is going to do is you'll have a leaner deck in round 2. You'll be culling a card out of your deck, and even an even smaller deck if you used Seek Allies for selective breeding. That means you can trash 2 cards out of your deck round 1. That's pretty strong. It means you're going to shuffle round 2 and have a good chance of hitting a card you buy. So high persuasion this round is likely you'll be able to buy something good, very likely. Maybe, a 5-coster or 4-coster that you really want, those sorts of things. The downsides is, again, like these other plays where you use all your water round 1, you're not going to have a lot of water for several rounds. You're not going to have a lot of spice for several rounds. You're going to have to go to the Imperial Basin probably. It means you're going to be putting a lot of weight on that card or cards that you buy. What about Research Station? If you go Still Suits Action 1 and then Research Station Action 2, is this actually a good play? Well, I mean, it's okay. It's kind of weird. You don't really get anywhere. You will shuffle round 2. You have a high persuasion likelihood, but the max persuasion you can have using this technique is 7. If you use Seek Allies to go to Still Suits, and then you use like any other card to go to Research Station that can get you there, you're going to end up with, at max, 7 persuasion, but I think 5 is about the minimum, or 4 is the minimum. Now you'd have to draw, the last 2 cards in your deck would have to be the daggers. So it's not a great idea, but if you really want to buy a card that's like a 6 cost, maybe you want to get a Gurney Halleck, this could work. I recommend maybe going to just Hall of Oratory and then maybe Arakeen instead, or something like that, just to, it's an easier, less involved way of getting some cards bought. And like all these other ones, no spice and no water. Fold space. Yeah, I don't know. In this version of the game, this is, I'm talking about, of course, the base game of Dune Imperium. It's a kind of a non-committal sort of weird space that people do, but only usually if there's a Smuggler's Thopter in the Imperial row. What I recommend is that, if you really like fold space, go for it. I generally don't do this sort of unless I'm just experimenting, but if you're playing with the expansion, I highly recommend it. This is definitely a great space, the expansion. What about secrets? Is this worth it? Well, it is. I mean, getting intrigue is good. It's non-committal. It doesn't drain your water. You can then go to Hardy Warriors or Haga Basin next round. And you could be a little low on water for several rounds, but you're not dependent on water. You still have 1 left over. It's good. It's okay. It's fine. But it's not a huge advantage. Okay, now that we've talked about all of those, what actually can you do? So what I wanted to show with this little presentation here so far is that the first player has first mover advantage. They can get to the things first, but they're not going to be able to capitalize them immediately. The first player will rotate to be the last player in round 2 and can't easily turn their resources into advantage. And going last in round 2 kind of sucks, because round 2 is the first time you're going to actually be able to do things like buy the Swordmaster, get to High Council. And if you've been setting up for that and you're going last, it might not work out. Okay, what about other kinds of advantages, such as combat? Well, we've already talked about one specific advantage, that you could go to Hardy Warriors Action 1 and then just like dump 4 troops into combat. You're likely going to win that combat. It's not 100%, but it's close to 100%. No one's really going to bother you. So if it's a point, you could get a point there, and then you can move up 2 tracks with the Baron, and that's not bad. It's the thing you could do. But again, as I mentioned, it's kind of an all-in strategy, and the game isn't won round 1. I've seen players playing the Baron get up to like 6 points and then stall out, and they are unable to regenerate resources fast enough to continue climbing the points, to keep getting troops, to keep doing the things they need to do. Okay, so combat run 1 sucks. Committing to combat can leave you out of combats for several rounds, and player 1 will get to be last for round 2. That kind of isn't a generally round 1 benefit. I'd say that if anything, the second player is going to be first in round 2 and will have a better choice. But then again, player 3 then becomes a second player. So it's this sort of rotating combat advantage, and first mover advantage is not really tied to the player. It's tied to what they have and can work with. What about the first player winning a majority of games? Well, the main thing I have to say about this is I don't even count the number of games I played of Dune Imperium. I've played a lot of the expansion as well at this point, and I've never seen a single, the first player win over and over again. I think there was one situation where we were playing 3-player, and each of there were 3 players, and I won a game, then my friend won a game, then my other friend won the game, and we were all first player in that situation. But that was a really weird, odd really odd situation. I haven't repeated that. The first player can win games. The second player can win games. The third player can win games. I've seen all the players win games. I've seen 4th players win games as well. It just depends on the things you choose to do, the characters you choose to draft at the beginning of the game. I mean, if I were to consider, an imbalance, I might even think about some of the best leaders for the game. Those like Helena Richesse, who I think has one of the higher win rates in the game because of her ability to be unobstructed at blue and green spaces. And her ring ability, her ring card is pretty powerful overall. Or I'd think about Raban. Raban is the best combat character in the game, and combat is where a lot of points are. So, he, on the other side of things, can just blitz you down. He can, if he ever gets an alliance, his ring gives him 2 troops. That's really hard to beat. He's a great character. Or even the Baron himself. If the Baron were actually here, he'd be very mad that I left him out of this discussion. He's my favorite character, so he is a good character, but I don't see the Baron winning a majority of games. I don't see any of these characters winning a majority. The closest, I think, is maybe Helena as most people's favorite for best character. Now, is there some other advantage that we're missing here? Well, we can talk about rushing Swordmaster, but the first player doesn't have the best way to rush Swordmaster. If the first player goes to, for instance, Still Suits, and then goes to the Imperial Basin for three spice, they have a chance of then cashing in that money and then Chome, and then going to buy the Swordmaster. That can happen. It can be useful. It can be a good plan. Getting your extra worker, your extra agent, is a good plan. But there are ways that can be disrupted, especially if players like or leaders like Raban are in the game. For instance, if you do this plan and you go Action 1, Still Suits, Raban, in whatever player order, probably second, maybe third, goes Action 1, I'm going to go to the Hog Basin. Well, Raban starts with 1 extra spice, so he can then immediately go and sell to Chome and then go buy his Swordmaster before you can, blocking you. So if that ends up being your plan, I don't know how good it's going to be over the course of several games. But if you end up being first player as Raban, then I think that you are in a very good place to, rush down the Swordmaster, and that is a very strong advantage. You can go to get 2 spice, have 3 in the bank, then go sell it, and then Action 1, round 2, and go get your Swordmaster. You are ahead of the game. You're ahead of everyone else. That's a very powerful play. Because of that, I highly recommend that players in a 4-player game, and I'm predominantly talking about 4-player here, that they try to keep Raban out of the first player's hands. Then I think that draft is not quite thought of in terms of the value that you could give the first player. Usually it's like, oh, which player do I want to play? So like, which player do I not want the first player to have? Because that's an important role. I think it's less important to have the first player play Helena, but the last player definitely wants to play Helena. I think the third player playing as Raban is a very strong play, and so on. So like, you'd probably want to think about that draft. So I'd say there are advantages to going first. I don't think they're game breaking. So just wrapping some of this stuff up, what do we know about the first player? First player goes first in rounds 1, 5, and 9. In a 3-player game, it's 1, 4, 7, and 10. The player 1 also gets the resources first, but has a hard time capitalizing on their resources. They can get blocked if they're rushing Swordmaster. They can make some pretty good early aggressive plays, but it might end up, backfiring. They can try to hostage the Grey Flat. It sometimes works, and they usually have a rough time in round 2. So just to kind of like summarize a little bit how first versus last works here. First is going to get dibs on those resources, and last is going to get last dibs, of course. First is going to be weakest in combat, and last is going to be strongest in combat. First will be weaker round 2, and last is going to be stronger round 2. So if you're thinking about last, I'm thinking about the fourth player or third player. Those are some strengths and weaknesses. The last is that pick in the draft. First picks last and last picks first. That's a really good equalizer that we need to kind of think about when we're playing the game. So again, strong choice. This is just a summary of when players will have a strong choice, the first action in a round. I mean, these are the moments that you want to essentially build up for. Those red numbers, those are the numbers that you want to build up for. So in other words, player 2 doesn't really have a great turn to build up for. 10, usually the game doesn't go to round 10, so they're going to want to try to capitalize round 6 and 7 if possible. They're going to go second in round 7. So if they can keep spice out of the player before them's hands, they'll be able to go to Highliner instead of them. Player 3 arguably has the best time getting to Highliner because they have the first level 3 conflict coming up on their strong choice turn, round 7. They also have strong turns in rounds 6 and 9 during 3-player games. And player 4 has a pretty strong game because usually the game ends round 7 or 8. Usually 8 is the average. And player 4, the last player, has then the strongest strong choice, round 8. They get to go first. That's a very strong turn. So it's something to consider. One thing we don't ever talk about is strong combat. When do players have strong combat? And this is kind of an interesting thing to compare. Player 1's going to have the strongest combat when they go last, rounds 2, 6, and 10. That means that they're going to have the hammer, right? That kind of like ability to come down with more troops than other people, or just to go over the top of someone else, provided they don't lose to intrigue or whatever, or that somebody doesn't get the mentat. There's always, a wrench in the plan. But player 2 is going to have a great 3 and 7 turn, right? Because they're going to go last. So they're not going to get first shot at Highliner, but they will get last chance to dump troops into the conflict. So there's always something to think about with regard to combat. These are just the ranges of strengths and weaknesses. What I want to say is that it's much more complicated to look at the game with these ideas in your head than just to say like, oh, first player's overpowered. It's not, and I don't think any of my friends have seen that happen. There are strengths and weaknesses to each position, and playing to those strengths and weaknesses can make you a better player. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful and interesting to you, and let me know in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.